Welcome viewers to my channel. This video is going to be addressing quite a complex topic. The aim is to explore and perhaps bring some clarity to a subject about which there has been much disagreement. Reproductive rights are, in many parts of the world, a contentious political issue. One of the key points being argued over is whether the scientific position in relation to when human life begins is a consensus or is it contested. As we are going to see, many activists and campaigners are turning to a study undertaken at Chicago University that claims to have some enlightening results. Leading pro-life campaigners claim that the results of this study show that their scientific beliefs are a scientific fact. Many pro-choice advocates do not contest these claims, opting instead to rely on a body autonomy argument. Is the biologists' consensus on when human life begins really a bulletproof paper? Well, let's find out. This is the bullet.
Lila, you say some things in the predicate of your positions that life begins at fertilization, that science is very clear about that. And you have to know science isn't, there's no consensus among the scientific community.
There is, Dr. Phil. 96% of scientists say that life begins at fertilization.
Okay, to clarify real quick, she's referring to a study done by Stephen Andrew Jacobs in which he surveyed over 5,000 scientists on whether or not human life starts at fertilization or not.
Jacobs was trying to establish in terms of biological facts when the human organism's life cycle begins. Countless pro-lifers have pointed to his work to show that it's not just pro-life people who recognize that fertilization is an important biological landmark. And in turn, a lot of pro-choice people have pushed back against Jacobs' work, although so far every critique I've seen appears to be by someone who hasn't read Jacobs' work.
But across more than 1,000 academic institutions, 96% of more than 5,500 biologists, most of whom with a PhD, believe that life, human life, begins at fertilization, biologically.
That seems to me to be the only sustainable view. You can't find, I don't think science has been able to find any other point at which you can define the beginning of life.
So we know that when that genetic code is established, it's not going to be a fish, it's not going to be a dog, it's going to be a human being. And that is the moment where exactly what kind of a human being is determined. And I just don't think that we have the right to intervene and terminate, kill that human being. That's why. That's why I think it's the only logically consistent line.
When does life begin?
At the moment of conception, when
the moment of
sperm
fertilization
and egg unite, when a unique, whole, living human being that never existed before and will never exist again comes into existence with a unique genetic code. And 96%,
Wait, so are twins not human?
Excuse me.
Hold on, just
no,
96% of biologists in the University of Chicago study.
Specifically, Jacobs asked biologists to state whether the following was true or false. In developmental biology, fertilization marks the beginning of a human's life, since that process produces an organism with a human genome that has begun to develop in the first stage of the human life cycle.
So it is a scientific fact.
Well, actually, it's not.
When do you say human life begins then?
It doesn't matter what I think. I don't care what I think. What I'm saying is the scientific community does not have a consensus about when life begins.
It's simply inaccurate. It's simply inaccurate.
That's not true.
As we have just heard, the subject of this video is the controversial study conducted by Steve Jacobs in 2018. We will be examining the content of that study, how it was conducted, the results and conclusions it deduced from the responses it obtained. The bullet will also be looking at how pro-life activists have referred to Steve Jacobs' paper and what Steve Jacobs himself has said about it. The paper is available online to download, and Steve Jacobs has appeared in at least 2 in-depth interviews discussing his paper. Links will be provided in the description below this video if you want to check those out. Many pro-life activists are citing this paper as a definitive document establishing the opinion of the scientific community. And it's not just pro-life advocates. A significant proportion of pro-choice advocates also hold this same opinion on when human life begins. I think it's best that we go straight to Steve Jacobs himself and see what he has to say about his paper.
In terms of the actual study asking biologists on when life begins, this started at Northwestern. I was taking a public persuasion class, one that taught us how to write speeches and deliver speeches. And I gave my first talk on abortion. And in the talk, I suggested that there was a consensus on when life begins based on my review of biological textbooks, medical school textbooks. And the professor after class actually wrote on my paper, where is the source next to my claim? And in that moment, I realized, oh yeah, if you want a source, I could go out and get the source. So what started, what he meant for evil, it ended up being for good, because he was trying to be snarky and undermine me. But all it did was plant the seed for me studying this question.
So the lack of a source planted the seed for Steve Jacobs to start studying the evidence for the claim that he had made that a consensus exists. There isn't anything inherently wrong with studying the consensus of opinion, but as a self-confessed pro-life advocate, it seems likely that the study will be aimed at obtaining a specific result. And there are ways that such a study could inadvertently or deliberately be manipulated to obtain the results that he got. Now let's look at how the targets for this study were obtained.
Well, how did you find these 5,577 biologists?
So hard work and determination. I spent 500 hours over the course of a summer binge watching Netflix while going through faculty pages for over 1,500 universities around the world. I had to translate Chinese faculty pages for Chinese universities into English. And basically, I generated a list of 70,000 biologists, and I was able to email them all.
So I ended up with a list of over 60,000 biologists from practically every university you've ever heard of, everyone I could get my fingers on. And over 7,000 had responded in some way to the survey. And my ultimate finding was over 5,500 had either affirmed or rejected the view that a human's life begins at fertilization.
So Steve Jacobs ended up with a list of over 60,000 biologists. He had over 7,000 respondents, and then discounted more than 1,500 as they had not confirmed or rejected the assertion that life begins at conception. Well, that makes over 25% of those that responded that were not prepared to confirm. The claim that there is a consensus of 96% is misleading and blatantly false.
So in terms of the birth, because there was all different ways of studying this, it was over 86 different countries. It was every continent represented. I didn't have as many scholars from Africa per se, but then I had, plenty from North America, from Australia, from China, from around the world. And not surprisingly, over 85% identified as pro-choice. I believe it was 92%.
That's pretty much the inclination of most academia these days, is left of center.
That's right. And in North America, 92% were Democrats. These were your typical left-leaning.
So if the deck was stacked, it was stacked against
overwhelmingly. So I had actually presented them with 5 different questions because I needed to vary the question in terms of how explicit or implicitly it was framed.
Well, that is strange, because the paper I read said that there were 3 questions and 1 open-ended question. 2 of the questions were implicit questions and 1 explicit question. That kind of looks like he doesn't want to show the results from a second explicit question. The study does give breakdowns on annual salary, number of children, marital status, gender, language, religion, political stance, ideological stance, abortion stance, and speciality in biology. Although quite interesting, all of those factors tended to make less difference than which of the 3 questions they were answering, and whether those questions were Steve Jacobs's implicit questions or explicit questions. Well, assuming that Steve Jacobs's research is genuine and not fabricated, the study does show that biologists working at universities that responded did tend to answer the questions to the affirmative. And I guess that is to be expected, because otherwise we wouldn't be discussing it.
Because if you just come out to biologists and say, is a fetus a human, that allows for enough of a signal that they might think this is a question related to abortion, and they would be more predisposed to answering strategically.
Okay, so Steve wanted to conceal the purpose of the study in case that would affect the results he obtained. He didn't want the largely pro-choice target to be aware that he was trying to obtain data to be used by pro-life, because that might change the way that they answer. I would say it could have other effects, and we will go into that shortly, but for now, let us just see how effectively did Steve Jacobs manage to conceal the purpose of this study.
So I actually had professors write letters to him and suggest that he had done something unethical by even supporting my project. And unfortunately, the water got a little too hot for him, and that caused him to pressure me to give up on my project. He wanted me to stop collecting data when I was only 20% of the way done. When I had only had 1,000 respondents, he said, "You're not continuing." He even suggested that he would recommend that I not receive my PhD. I mean, there were biologists calling for me to be kicked out of my department.
And I was lucky to even get 5,000 because my study got shut down 5 different times. Every time I started my study, within 1 week, it was shut down by a different entity.
Absolutely. And I had so many biologists answer the survey and affirm that it's a human, and then send me a long email about how important abortion is, that this allowed them to have the career that they wanted if they hadn't personally had an abortion. And I had people calling me a zygote worshiper and saying that I was going to facilitate the end of the world because we're so overpopulated. And if abortion doesn't...
that old chestnut.
if it doesn't control population growth...
That's only centuries old, that one.
So I'm currently working to get my actual research published in journals. And surprise, surprise, most aren't very interested in even considering it. But I will find a home for them eventually. Interesting thing about peer review is they don't actually check your data. They focus on your arguments and how well those arguments fit within a broader body of research. So essentially, my data stands on its own. I'm not even making any arguments. I just want people to know that that indeed abortion is a form of homicide. And after I'd only collected like 700 participants, and they were only Americans at that point, I later broadened it to the whole world. So he basically told me that he would try to, effectively he said he would try to get me kicked out of the program if I continued. He told me that he would not continue to support me, and he would recommend that I not receive my degree.
That's one thing we didn't get to. The fact that not only was my study shut down 5 times, my advisor threatened to leave my project.
And this is almost unprecedented for something like this to happen. I've talked to other ethics committees. When research is approved by an ethics committee, the only time that a professor leaves that project is when they move, when they pass away, when there's like a huge scandal.
Because he didn't want to sign off on a project that would produce data that members of the pro-life movement could use.
And unfortunately, even though they affirm that biological view, they still let me know, well, this doesn't mean that they have rights. This doesn't mean that I'm against abortion.
And this was after I had to ask, several different professors to step up and support my research after he abandoned me. So you have no idea what the politics were.
And so Steve had academics basically calling for his study to be boycotted by the whole scientific community. If there are 1,500 respondents that were unwilling to give a definitive answer, is it possible that there exists a larger proportion that don't consider the question as valid at all? Could it be that many simply decided not to? or were put off from responding, it would certainly seem that the main opposition to the assertion that life begins at conception is the section that Steve Jacobs ignored, not the 4% that refuted the claim. If the people who are not prepared to give a definitive answer are also people that are unlikely to respond, then you can see how a bias is beginning to form. This bias can be exacerbated through the use of loaded language in the questions. The fact is, the term human organism predates the discovery of genetics. Or to be more accurate, it predates the modern understanding of genetics. The study of genetics has existed for thousands of years, the study of traits being passed from generation to generation, from parent to child. But the simple answer only remains true until you look closer. And so let's look at some examples of pro-life advocates being incorrect.
If you look at the sperm cell, its composition is the genetic material of the father, different then from the egg cell because its composition is the genetic material of the mother. You look at the behavior of a sperm. It's to swim around, find an egg, and penetrate it. You look at the behavior of an egg, very different from a sperm. It sits and allows for penetration. We know at fertilization we're dealing with something new. The genetic material that each of us has, our own blueprint, that distinguishes us from our mother, our father, and every single human being unless we have identical twins, that is determined at the moment of sperm-egg fusion. And from that point forward, we change what we look like and what we're able to do. But our essential nature remains the same. We're human at that moment because our parents are human and beings reproduce after their own kind. We're alive at that moment because the one-celled embryo is growing from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8, 16, and so forth. And the growth there is indicative of life. The human parents is indicative of being human, and the fact that we're genetically distinct at that moment, separating us from our parents, makes us the next generation.
An egg is part of a woman's body. When sperm and egg unite, they create a unique, living, whole human being that's never existed before and never exists again. A sperm is a part that can be used to create a whole living human being. But it's not full DNA. It's not a human person. Science tells us that sperm and eggs aren't persons. But a zygote, an embryo, a fetus is a human being, is a person that's never existed before and will never exist ever again. That has unique genetic code.
Essentially, what those pro-life activists are saying is rhetoric, use of persuasive language. They claim that it is science, but there is many logical and scientific flaws in this rhetoric. I'm going to get a bit technical now, so I'm probably going to hand over to an animated character so that you can't see me reading from this cheat sheet I've got down here somewhere. A reproductive cell is produced, and at that moment it has the function of becoming a new human being. That cell will go through a process called meiosis, where it divides twice, forming 4 haploid cells, all of which are genetically unique. But the individualization process has already begun. It doesn't suddenly happen at fertilization. Reproductive cells or gametes from a human being are human, so obviously they themselves do not meet the criteria of a different species, a cat or something. Gametes are alive. They are living cells. The sperm cells literally swim with those iconic tadpole tails. So many pro-life advocates try to argue that alive plus human equals a person. Their argument falls flat on its face because not only do gametes meet that criteria, like every living human cell in the human body, but they are genetically unique and they have a singular purpose of becoming a new human being. Therefore, the difference between a fertilized and unfertilized egg is finite. A lot of pro-life rhetoric can be rendered void simply by asking if their point would apply equally to a gamete. And the simple fact is you can't fertilise a dead ovum. Life, in that context, categorically does not begin at conception.
Yes, it does make sense. I just disagree.
So you said you disagree that it's not a human, it's a human being. Like, you agree, right, that at the moment of conception, a human being is created.
Wait, what?
Do you agree that when sperm and egg unite, the moment of conception, fertilization, that unique human
being, yeah.
Is that collection of cells unique human being?
It's collection of cells to start creating a fetus, which grows into an embryo, which grows into a human being. Yes, I agree with that.
Oh, you just denied science.
I didn't deny science.
Because embryo, zygote, fetus, infant, toddler, adolescent, those aren't things we came from. They were people, parts, that's who we are. That's a stage of our development. I didn't come from an embryo. I didn't come from a fetus. I once was one because that's a natural stage of human development.
Even after conception, a fertilised egg is able to divide into identical twins or multiples with identical genetics. Back to these 4 haploid cells. Not just 4, the progenitor cell repeats this process until there are hundreds of thousands or many millions of these cells. This is where the male and female differ. In male humans, this process begins at puberty and continues throughout their adult life. In a female, the gametes are all produced in the 3rd embryonic trimester and become dormant, residing in the ovarian follicles in the ovaries. These gametes are brought out of hibernation during ovulation, but they have existed on average for about 30 years by the time they get fertilised, if that occurs. But the chance of an individual female gamete or oocyte being fertilised is over 100,000 to 1. Only a few hundred over will ovulate during a woman's lifetime. It's quite a claim to say that our nature and abilities are all genetic. I think there are studies involving identical twins that go quite a way to disproving that, amongst other evidence. Like most of these tales I am examining from these pro-life advocates, it is an oversimplification of the science that they have heard. Maybe in some future video I will share more about my thoughts on this, but for now I will go off on a different tangent. Here's a remark by Stephen Crowder.
Scientifically, the moment of conception is when there's an entirely different genetic code that determines everything. Hair color, eye color, height, sense of smell, athletic ability is created at conception. Science tells us that is a new, unique human being, and I don't think that we ever have the right to kill another human being.
I think that that's your interpretation of science. I definitely believe that, stem cells have the potential to turn into any sort of specialized tissue, and you're right. It is a seed that has the potential to become a new person.
Well,
the reason that I'm pro-life,
sperm is a seed, but that's the exact. For example, I don't see sperm killing a sperm the same as abortion.
The idea that a sperm is a seed is a scientific concept that faded out during the 19th century. Prior to the invention of microscopes, fertilization wasn't really understood the way it is today. It was thought that a sperm is a seed that plants inside a woman. There was also a theory called pangenesis that suggested the reason genetic traits were inherited was that sperm was contributed to by small particles, sent like hormones, presumably from each part of the body. Anyway, back to seeds. There are different types of plant that reproduce in different ways, but assuming we are talking about plants that produce seeds, then the normal way that works is pollination. Pollen is a gamete that fertilizes the oocyte of another plant, and the seed formed from that process, is called an embryo. Now, horticultural people germinate saplings in a nursery, and the point being that Steve is wrong, and the female student he is interviewing is 100% correct in the scientific context. All species have a reproductive process. If you look up human reproduction, you will always find a description of gestation. The embryonic stage is a reproductive stage. What are you reproducing if not a human being? The number of children you have increases by an integer at birth. The age of an unborn child is less than 0. I'm simply repeating the language used, how the unborn are commonly considered, the labels, the scientific categories. But if I make a survey that concludes 80% of people agree that the number of children you have increases by an integer at birth, does that mean anything? Does the fact that an embryo has not yet reached the criteria of a complete and full human being mean anything? That if you miscarry, you should be less upset than if your born child dies as such? How would I possibly be able to quantify that any more accurately or unempathetically than A is less than B or A less than B?